In the last 4.5 years, I've covered dozens of missing persons cases on this channel. And if there is one thing I have learned as a result, it is that the vast majority of mysterious disappearances are largely the result of people just making bad decisions. Yes, there are a good number of stories where it seems like foul play was the cause, and a few have left me genuinely baffled, but the fact of the matter is that, in most cases, the disappearance was completely avoidable. And in most of those cases, it's because somebody just left the trail. When I set out to make this video, my thought process was, let's ask the question of why do people go missing and then try and drill down to one specific reason. But what I found as I went was that it kind of has to operate the other way around. Ultimately, I found that the question is, why do people go off trail? And when I asked myself that question, I came up with a few specific reasons, and I won't pretend that this is an exhaustive list, but a few specific general reasons why people end up leaving the trail, and I want to go over how you can avoid them. And those reasons are, primarily, that people are unprepared, people separate from the group, people take a wrong turn or follow a false trail, or in some cases, a parent or guardian's lack of attention leads to a child or disabled person wandering off before anybody even notices they're gone. And then, of course, there's panic. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. This video is about one thing in particular, the factors that go into people disappearing in the wilderness and how you can avoid them. But there is one factor you shouldn't avoid, and they're the sponsor for this week's video. If you've noticed that I'm looking a bit more trim these days, there is a reason for that, and that reason is Factor. In fact, I'm so pleased with their product, that being fresh, chef-crafted, and dietitian-approved meals delivered straight to my doorstep, that I actually approached them about sponsoring the channel this time around. Now, there's a lot I could say about Factor, like how much I enjoy the 100+ rotating meal options, the selection of add-ons like breakfast, shakes, and even lattes, or how it's a convenient way to get a balanced meal full of good carbs, healthy fats, protein, and at least 2 vegetables without all the hassle. But honestly, the thing I think matters most to you guys is that this is a product I actually do use in my everyday life. At least a few nights a week, my fiance and I pop a couple of these bad boys into the microwave, and 2 minutes later, we're enjoying a succulent meal without having to deal with all the prep and the cleanup. And right now, you can get 50% off your first box, plus free daily greens, a once daily greens drink that you'll actually look forward to drinking with real veggies and nutrients that you might be missing in your daily diet. Just head to factor75.com right now or click the link in the description and use code LORELodgeFDG to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free daily greens. Once again, that's code LORELodgeFDG at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free daily greens. One of the most frequent and also one of the most avoidable reasons that I have found people disappear is that they were simply not prepared for the trip they decided to go on. Now, that can mean a number of things. It could be that somebody did not properly plan their route. It could mean that they didn't bring the right clothing, or it could mean that they just stepped into a place that they never should have gone. And while it might sound like that is the kind of thing that would only befall people who aren't experienced in the outdoors, well, you'd be surprised. For example, the Dyatlov group from the famous Dyatlov Pass mystery. By all accounts, the Dyatlov group should have made it to their destination and back without incident. Their plan was to take this long trek out to a specific mountain, climb it, come back down, and head back home. The route was difficult, but they were all experienced hikers and were, at least on paper, well prepared for the journey. Their problem looks to have been time management more than anything else, with everything after that being a part of a cascading series of consequences linked to one bad decision, starting the next phase of the trek too late in the day. According to their journals and later investigations, the Dyatlov group appears to have cached most of their supplies at the base of Peak 1079, also known as Kholat Syakhl, or Dead Mountain, before attempting to hike over it. The idea here was that they didn't need all of their gear with them in order to make the final ascent, which involved going over this one peak and then climbing another. So, rather than trying to carry everything with them and then having to carry it all the way back, they only took what they needed and left everything else behind in one spot. Now, this was the right choice. This was what they were supposed to do, but the problem was that they took longer than they expected to construct the cache and ended up having to leave in the middle of the afternoon rather than late in the morning as previously planned. As a result, they had only just reached the point where they'd begin to descend the slope of Peak 1079 when it began to get dark. From that point on, just about everything else in this story is something of a mystery, but one fact remains above all else. If they'd started earlier, or simply chose to set up camp in the tree line a kilometer further down, they would have been shielded from the elements in a much more significant way, and the rest of the story might not have happened. And if it seems odd that this ended up in the lack of preparedness section, it's partially because this was originally two sections, that one of them was bad decisions and one was being unprepared, but in this case, they weren't prepared. I mean, this is maybe me excusing my formatting of the video. They were not prepared for potentially being off by a day in their trek. Most importantly, they were not prepared to observe the situation before them and make the correct decision of hiking down to the tree line. Call that cope, if you will, but the next one on the list is definitely a lack of preparedness situation. That's because the next one on my list here is Jordan Grider. And off the bat, I have to say that Jordan Grider is one of the weirder cases we've covered, in large part because of the condition in which his remains were discovered. What is not a mystery, however, is how he disappeared for several months before anyone stumbled across his campsite. Not only did Jordan place himself in an area that wasn't connected to any active trails, but he didn't give anyone his exact coordinates in case someone had to go looking for him. All he told anyone was that there was a pond nearby, and in Minnesota, that's not a particularly helpful piece of information. On top of that, he'd only brought along some dried grains for food, a tarp for a tent, a hammock for a bed, and a sleeping bag for warmth. So even if something bizarre hadn't befallen him, and bizarre it was, he most likely wouldn't have survived the winter due to the fact that he parked his car over a mile away and couldn't easily access it. There were a lot of stages in Jordan's story where he could have been more prepared, where he could have made better decisions, but that's not how it went. Now, once again, what happened to Jordan was not the cold. It was not the winter that got him, at least not in any literal sense of the term. My point is that regardless of what ended up happening, he put himself into a position where he was absolutely unprepared to survive a Minnesota winter. And on top of that, despite having a vehicle, he did not leave it in a place where he could easily get to it and thus find the warmth that he would so desperately need once, January came. But we also have stories that are sort of the precise opposite of that, like Kenny Veach. Now, Kenny's story is famous primarily due to what he was looking for, rather than how he actually disappeared. But that being said, it's likely that the reason he didn't come back was related to a lack of preparation, though some have argued that his disappearance was intentional. But whether or not he intended to end his own life out in the desert near Las Vegas, Kenny made a few decisions that ultimately sealed his fate. For one, he started off into the wilderness rather than following a trail. He did not bring enough water with him. It's unclear precisely what camping gear he brought. And, he didn't tell anybody where he was going. He did tell his family where he was going, at least according to his then-girlfriend, but the problem is that he didn't really know where he was going. Now, if you're not familiar with the story, Kenny was trying to find a mysterious M-shaped cave, which he claimed to have stumbled across once before, but like him, nobody was sure where it actually was, and to this day, people are still uncertain whether or not it's been found. And of course, as with the Dyatlov group, this kind of factors in with just bad decisions overall as well, but he did not have the equipment necessary to survive the journey he was going on. And he also said in multiple comments and in other videos that he did not frequently bring much with him. He would wear long pants to prevent snakes, and he would bring like a bottle or two of water with him to go walking in the desert for hours or days at a time. And he had a gun. That's really it. Now, if Kenny had been properly prepared, for example, having a locator beacon, a satellite phone, a GPS locator of some kind, proper clothing, proper camping equipment, a vessel that could carry more than 2 pints of water, he might have survived long enough to be found. Now, that being said, it did not help that nobody reported him missing until November 14th, when he left on November 10th, which was possibly because he may have told his family and friends that he planned to camp for a couple of nights before returning home, But that was not the biggest problem. Despite Kenny reportedly having his phone, camping gear, and a 9mm handgun, only the phone was ever found, and he apparently left it behind almost immediately after setting out, which is why some people have looked at this as a deliberate disappearance situation. But probably the most obvious form of a lack of preparedness situation that we've ever looked at is that of Truman Everett's, a man who was too old, too out of shape, too inexperienced, and entirely too confident in his own abilities to have been anywhere near what would one day become Yellowstone National Park. And he's probably one of the best case studies in lost persons behavior that I've ever seen. You see, he documented his entire experience after his rescue, which is how we know that he did just about every wrong thing possible, completely lost track of how much time was passing, miscalculated the distance between himself and safety, severely underestimated the difficulty of crossing rough terrain, and eventually began hallucinating that he was either being aided or harassed by a series of ghostly apparitions, all of which, of course, could have been avoided if he'd packed properly and stuck with the group rather than trying to go off on his own. But the reason I say that this is a particularly enlightening missing persons story, a good case study in missing persons behavior, is that it allows us to see, and I'll admit that Truman probably emphasized and exaggerated and, the whatnot, but what it allows us to see is the development of somebody's state of mind as they're missing for a long period of time. He was gone for weeks. Everyone thought he was dead, and they were looking for his body. That was incredibly confusing when they eventually found him. And where they found him was so incredibly far away from where he went missing, and in a place that made absolutely no sense for him to be. It tells us a lot about how the brain works when you're lost. And unfortunately, how the brain works when you're lost, and particularly when you're lost and alone, is that it starts to become irrational after a certain period of time. And that is what's going to lead us into our next series of disappearances, which are those which happened almost entirely because somebody decided to separate from their group. As we go through these stories, there's one thing that I want you to keep in your mind, and that is that most of these have been featured in Missing 411 books, videos, movies, something to that extent, as, mysterious, inexplicable cases where there's no understanding for why these people disappeared, and, subtly, it's trying to convince you that it's Bigfoot. And in fact, all three of the ones in this chapter of the video are Missing 411 stories, but the one I want to start with is that of Aaron Hedges, which is the story that forced me to reconsider what was really happening with the Missing 411 phenomenon, and also the reason that David Politis ended up threatening to sue me last year. Now, I'd recommend watching our episode on Aaron Hedges, and also the Missing Enigmas coverage of the case to get the full picture of what happened there, but the part relevant to this video is that Aaron decided to go off on his own, continued beyond the limits of radio contact with his group, and then failed to retrace his steps for some reason. Now, the reason why he departed from the group and made irrational decisions as a whole is not necessarily a mystery. He was taking benzodiazepines to combat alcoholic withdrawal symptoms while continuing to drink, but that doesn't change the fact that he likely would not have gone missing if he hadn't separated from his companions. One way we can say that for sure is that his companions didn't go missing. Now, in Aaron's case, the going off trail thing doesn't necessarily apply as much because they were hunting, so they were going to be off trail. And the same can be said of Truman Everett's, and to some extent for Kenny Veach and also the Dyatlov group. Most of the ones I've gone through so far don't really have a trail to begin with. And believe it or not, Aaron is not the only example of something along this line, somebody departing from the group and going missing while they are hunting, that we have covered, nor is it the only one in Montana. Rob Springfield disappeared while on a hunting trip in Montana back in 2004, and while there are some questions to be asked about his situation, there is one thing that could have prevented him from going missing: the buddy system. Rob was out there as one member of a three-party group, which included his son Colton and a man named Brent Brooks, whose relation to Rob and Colton is a little fuzzy. But the trouble started when he set off to drive game towards the other two in the group. The plan was for him to head out west and loop around back to a pre-selected spot where Colton and Brent would be waiting to take the target down. But Rob never showed. There are a number of possibilities as to what happened, which we covered in our video on the case a little while back, but if we assume that foul play wasn't the cause of his disappearance, then the sad truth is that having a fourth person along for the hunt would probably have saved his life. If Rob had become injured, incapacitated, something to that extent, then that other person could have hiked out to get help, or potentially even just used the radio. If he was attacked by a wild animal like a bear or a cougar or something like that, then having 2 people vastly increases your chances of survival. Not only are wild animals less likely to attack multiple people at once, but if there's only one of them and there's 2 of you and you have weapons, then you can actually intervene. It's even possible that if it was foul play, having a second person there with him could have prevented whatever happened from happening. It is very rare that a situation cannot be made less dangerous by having a friend there with you. And while in Rob's case, there was obviously the issue of they were hunting and this was all part of a plan, and it might have been better to have a solo hunter doing the driving, who knows what the reasoning could have been here. When it comes to the case of Jim McGrogan, he had his friends with him, and then he just decided to leave them. Now, Jim's case is one of the more unusual stories we've looked into on this channel, but the short version is that he was a medical doctor on a boys' trip to go splitboarding in Vail, Colorado, was last seen by his friends as he made his way further up the trail, and then somehow ended up at the bottom of a cliff several miles east of their destination. According to his group, they were about an hour into their hike when most of them decided to take a break, but Jim didn't want to stop moving. Instead, he told them that he'd either take a break later and wait for them to catch up, or he'd meet them at Eisenman Hut at the end of the trail. Thing is, when his friends made it to Eisenman Hut, he was not there, nor was he anywhere on the trail. Nor did there appear to be any tracks leading away from the trail. Which is why it's weird. If I'm remembering correctly, because I had to write this entire video in a day, I believe that the last contact anyone had with Jim was him making a cell phone call from about 500 yards or half a mile or something like that above where he last talked to his friends, and that was it. He never activated his avalanche beacon, he never attempted to make any calls, and the reason the story is weird is that at the altitude he was sitting at, he should have been able to tell that he was not where he was supposed to be. He would have been able to see Vail down below him, he probably would have had self-service, depending on his carrier, and it was pretty obvious that he wasn't going the right direction. I mean, he may have taken a wrong turn, there was a spot where that could have happened, and it seems like that probably is what happened, but at a certain point, he would have realized that he was heading the wrong direction, because if you're going up, and you know that the thing you're going towards is to your left, then you can only go so far to your right before you realize you probably messed up. I've never fully understood Jim McGrogan's disappearance, to be quite honest, but the one thing we can say for sure is that if he stuck with his group, he almost certainly would have made it to his destination. But instead, he took a wrong turn. Now, technically, no matter what you're looking at, if somebody leaves the trail, they have taken a wrong turn. But for this chapter, I decided to focus on things where that was like the driving factor. And what I mean by that is that someone was on the trail and they left it for no reason other than that they intended to do so. Now, I don't necessarily mean that they were aware they were leaving the trail when they did it. I just mean that they did not panic. They were not off trail to begin with. They were not in some situation that forced them off of the trail, but rather that they were on the trail and then they saw a false trail or they wanted to go take a picture of something, and so they left it. There are a number of cases that this applies to, but the first one I want to look at is Charles McCuller, because when I first looked at the case of Charles McCuller, I was pretty convinced that he'd fallen victim to foul play. Based on what I found, it seemed very difficult to explain how it was that he ended up as far off the trail as he did, given the fact that he seemed to have been trained by his Special Forces operative father. We know that he knew how to craft snowshoes, how to set up a tent, start a fire in snowy conditions, and so on, so how could a guy like that end up dying? Now, I even went as far in that video as to say that it seems plainly obvious to any person with at least 3 brain cells that this was foul play, and my thinking was, maybe he was kidnapped or abducted and somebody used a snowmobile to get him that deep into the woods because he was at Crater Lake and he ended up just way down the southern slope of the volcano. So my thinking was like, it doesn't make sense that he would be out there. Why would he go there? It didn't seem like a reasonable decision. And so maybe somebody abducted him, maybe he ran into an illegal grow operation, maybe he crossed the wrong person, what have you, and somebody took him out there on a snowmobile and dumped him and staged it to look weird. But a few years after making that video, and one very persuasive conversation with Nick from The Missing Enigma later, I must now admit it was I who lacked the brain cells here. I was missing one crucial thing, a proper understanding of the terrain. Nick actually went out there to see it for himself, and from his work, it is abundantly clear that Charles could have gotten to where his remains were found on his own, and that he probably got there by following a frozen creek bed, which he may have known was a creek bed, may have thought was a trail, or might have thought would lead him to a good place to camp and or take pictures, because he was there to take photographs. Now, how exactly he met his fate is difficult to say, but it seems the most likely explanation for the whole scenario is that he left the trail to look for a campsite or find a spot to take a picture, and ended up either lost or injured in an area that nobody thought to search. And nobody thought to search it because it was just so far from the trail, and not a place that people usually went. In fact, that section of the park wasn't even open necessarily. They weren't really going to stop you from going, but the gates were closed and he had to enter through a different side. And this, of course, is why you should not go off trail for any reason, and especially not in a park you're unfamiliar with. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you are safe doing so in parks that you're familiar with. And one prime example of this is the disappearance of Barbara Bullock. While currently viewed as an accidental disappearance, there are questions about how honest the last person to see her alive was, but barring foul play, it's an incredibly strange case, and one that most likely began with Barbara accidentally leaving the main trail to follow a false one, only to realize her mistake once she became lost in the wilderness. And at the time, she was very familiar with the Bear Creek Overlook Trail, so she should have known better than to do so, which is why it's so confusing that she ended up going missing. This is not a loop trail, this is not a particularly wilderness-heavy trail, it's pretty easy to follow based on pictures that I've found on AllTrails, and she was familiar with it. So it's hard to understand how it is that she goes missing, especially because the place she goes missing is in fact the turnaround point. It is an in and out. She and the man she was hiking with, who was a friend of a family friend, if I'm remembering correctly. A boyfriend of a family friend or an in-law or something to that extent. And as the story goes, they were at the overlooking, and Barbara wanted to stay and look a little bit longer, she wanted to take in the view or what have you, and her companion ended up starting down the trail before her, and then only realized later on, when she didn't return on her own, that something must be wrong. So he sprints back up the trail to look for her, still doesn't find her, and then comes back, but the last place she's seen is at the overlook, and that's where the hunt for her starts. Like I said, there are reasons to believe that foul play might have been involved here, but this is one of those situations where if she did go missing, the only real explanation is that she followed a false trail, which just goes to show you that if this is not foul play, even people who know the trail they're on really well can still make mistakes. And this appears to be the situation with another person we've covered recently, and that is Sam Sayers. Now, it's unknown what happened, but once again, I do have reason to believe she was a victim of foul play, potentially due to oversharing about her plans on Facebook. I actually almost included this as its own category due to that opinion, but I felt it was best to refrain from speculating due to the nature of this video. So if Sam wasn't a victim of foul play, then she most likely ended up off-trail by accident. Which is weird, because the trail she was on, which the name of it's escaping me right now, was something she had climbed at least half a dozen times. Now, this is a trail that is not particularly easy to follow, because for the most part, once you get above a certain point, it's just rocks. But she knew where she was going. She had done this before. And from what we can tell, she made it to the end of the trail just fine, to the turnaround. It was Vesper Peak, there we go. She made it to the peak, and then turned around and started heading back. She should have been able to get where she was going, she should have known what she was doing, but if it wasn't foul play, then she must have at some point stepped off the trail, despite knowing it very well, and gotten herself into a position where she really couldn't get out. Now, what would have happened after she stepped off trail is anyone's guess, because they searched everywhere and have never found anything, but it's certainly not the only time that this has happened. I think the most clear-cut example of one of these situations is that of Paul LeMay. Now, Paul was taking part in the Mount Marathon race in Seward, Alaska, which is every 4th of July, and once again, it's escaping me when this happened for some reason. I looked it up. It was July 2012. Now, this one could have gone in several categories, because Paul LeMay was a little on the older side. If I remember correctly, he was in his 50s, and he was not in shape to be taking on this race. It's hard. This is not your average holiday turkey trot or something like that. This is a race that consists of 2 phases, the first of which is a mad scramble to a false peak at 3,000 feet, And then the second is basically a controlled fall down a path parallel to the first. Paul was last seen just below that turnaround point, but somehow he never made it down and his body has never been recovered. And when we went to Alaska to see the mountain for ourselves, it became abundantly clear that the most likely explanation was that Paul attempted to take an alternate route down the slope. He was an older guy, like I said, not well prepared for the race, and he actually took so long to just reach the halfway mark that those last people to see him up there were the race officials, who were on their way back down by that point. After a brief exchange in which they told him he was welcome to finish the race on his own and pointed out where the turnaround was, Paul probably got there, realized he wasn't cut out for the scramble back down, and decided to take one of the less aggressive hiking trails which zigzag up the slope of the mountain. The problem is that halfway down, he would have hit the point where the loose shale gives way to shrubs and then trees, and as we now know, during the Alaskan summer, that section of the mountain is extremely lush. There's large ferns, all sorts of shrubs and plants, and once you hit the trees, you find yourself faced with more and more false trails the closer you get to the base. We were actively trying to avoid taking a false trail when we were there, and it still only took us about 10 minutes to get onto one. I wouldn't call this a scientific opinion, but having climbed most of that mountain, I got a little freaked out about the heights and had to come back down. Aiden, though, he and our new friend Noah went to the very top, and I'm glad I didn't. But being up there very quickly made us believe that if you were to be jogging down that mountain in July and fell off the trail, twisted an ankle, something like that, you would be so covered by brush that it would be extremely difficult to find you. Basically, the only way anyone's going to see you in there is if you are making noise, and if you have fallen and knocked yourself out, you're not going to be making noise. So unfortunately, it really appears that had Paul come down the main route, or simply stayed where he was at the top of the mountain once he realized that he couldn't get back down on his own, he almost certainly would have been rescued. Sadly, it seems that he panicked about getting back down and ended up making a choice which cost him his life. And of course, this brings us to the next category of reasons that people go missing in my experience, which is panic on the trail. There are a number of cases that I could have started with for this segment of the video, but the one that I think is just the most emblematic of the whole panicking issue is that of Eloise Lindsay, which, while certainly not identical, does share that specific detail of the person panicking. Now, Eloise was on a solo hike along the Foothills Trail in Table Rock State Park down in South Carolina, and her exact route was a 43-mile trek that would take her west into North Carolina and then back south across the border to the other end of the Foothills Trail near Bad Creek. To be completely honest, this was a bad plan from the start, not only because of the distance, but because going hiking alone is rarely a good idea, unless you're sticking to a very small area and have planned check-ins with people who know your planned route. But Eloise had actually lied to her family about going with a friend, and the only way anyone would have known she was missing is if she didn't turn up at the end of the trail. Which is what happened. Initially, the thought was maybe she took a false trail, maybe she went down to the water, maybe she tried to camp somewhere. But as everyone would eventually learn, Eloise did not take a wrong turn, injure herself, or eat some poison berries. No, she had left the trail in a panic because she believed she was being followed by strange men. Now, I have gone back and forth on this, because on the one hand, I could see people in the 80s kind of just writing her off as being neurotic and saying, no, she was definitely not followed, but maybe she actually was. On the other hand, I have yet to find any evidence that she was being followed, and her story doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense. But I think that this is an important one to look at because it is something that could happen to just about anybody. Someone might leave the trail because they think they're being stalked by a predator. Somebody might leave the trail because they think they're being stalked by a different kind of predator. Someone might be freaked out about weather that's coming in and go off to look for shelter. Panic is a state of mind that is very difficult to fight. And it is something that makes you irrational, that completely overpowers you, and causes you to do things that, in a proper state of mind, you would know are a bad idea. Take, for example, Mark Hansen, who went missing in the Great Smoky Mountains back in 1975. Now, Mark's disappearance could be chalked up to a number of things, including lack of proper preparation and the failure of his more experienced partner to recognize the signs of exhaustion, but what really did him in was desperation. He pushed too far on a trail he wasn't ready to be hiking during one of the most difficult times of the year, and ended up wearing himself out before he'd reached the next trail shelter. And in case it wasn't clear, I am talking about the Appalachian Trail as it goes through the Great Smoky Mountains, a place that his friend should never, ever have brought him, because Mark Hansen not only had never been hiking on the Appalachian Trail before, but had in fact never been hiking on a real trail. And when I say his friend should have recognized the signs, I don't just mean that Mark was complaining about being tired, I mean Mark was complaining about being so tired that he actually left his backpack, which had all of his supplies in it, behind as they continued to push towards the next shelter, which is just unbelievable. Unbelievable oversight by the friend here. I have been on the Appalachian Trail when it is warm out and become exhausted. In our situation, we had no choice but to push on because we were half a mile from the trail shelter. But in Mark Hansen's situation, he was complaining of exhaustion at a trail shelter before they set off for Tricorn, which is the one where they were trying to reach when he died. So his friend, I cannot comprehend why his friend pushed him any further here. He was not prepared for this. He was not cut out for it. They should have stayed and they should have headed back the next day. But instead, Mark's friend encouraged him to push through, and he ended up worn out, exhausted, on the trail, and this put him in a very difficult position as he faced either spending the night sleeping on the ground beside the trail and risking hypothermia, because he didn't have any of his supplies, or trying to fight his way out by following water downstream, which is typically, in most cases, a good bet. Water tends to lead toward civilization. But in the Smokies, that's not quite the case. Unfortunately, that is the option Mark chose, but instead of finding himself closer to civilization, he ended up exhausted and stuck several hundred yards down a drainage, unable to call for help, and well outside the initial search area. The rangers figured that he'd gone one direction or the other on the trail or followed an offshoot somewhere, but he was just down in the bush. Alternatively, had he stayed put or attempted to walk back down the trail, hypothermia still would have been a concern, but if he did survive the night, he almost certainly would have been rescued. And Hansen isn't the only such case we've looked at in the past, nor is it the only one to happen in the Smokies. 5 years earlier, in 1970, 16-year-old Boy Scout Jeffrey Haig ended up passing away in almost the exact same circumstances as Hansen. According to newspaper reports, Jeff had gotten into a fight with some of the other scouts the night before, and when it was time to leave the campsite and head home, he slipped off to take a different route back to the parking lot. Now, whether he did this because he was upset with the others and didn't want to be on the trail with them, or because he thought it would be shorter, or just because, he thought it was the right direction, which probably wasn't the case, that different route turned out not to lead to the parking lot. And by the time he realized that, he was probably facing exhaustion. We've actually gone to the spot where he most likely went off the trail, and it would have been, if you're exhausted, that would have been a hard choice to make. It really does look like if you just go down, you will eventually reach the highway, eventually reach a road, a stream, something that's going to lead you out of there. But it's not that kind of place. Unequivocally, he would have been much better off either staying on the trail or trying to get back to the trail shelter. But instead, he tried to hike down a drainage towards the highway, ended up tiring himself out, and then he got stuck and succumbed to hypothermia. But there is one thing, which is that this could also qualify for another situation that I found leads people to go missing, which is a lack of attentiveness from a parent or guardian figure. And that brings us to the next thing. When it comes to missing children in particular, parental or supervisory inattentiveness seems to be the most frequent cause of disappearances. And that is true of probably the best-known missing 411 case out there, that being Dennis Martin, who vanished from Spencefield in the Great Smoky Mountains over Father's Day weekend in 1969. About a week before his 7th birthday. According to the National Park Service chronological narrative of the case, sometime around 4:30 in the afternoon, Bill Martin lost sight of his sons, Doug and Dennis, and 2 other boys atop the ridge, and after 3 to 5 minutes became concerned when Dennis didn't reappear. Bill eventually learned from his older son, Doug, that the boys had planned to play a prank on the adults, with the intention of splitting up, sneaking away, and approaching them from 2 different directions. It's unclear what the point of this prank was, but obviously something went wrong, and Dennis did not find his way back to where he was supposed to be. We've done a considerable amount of coverage on this case, including a visit to Spence Field and a 2-hour video on what we know happened and what we believe might have happened, but the why it happened is actually pretty simple at the end of the day. Even though we can't be sure how Dennis actually disappeared, as in, which trail he went down, if somebody abducted him, if he, fell over a small cliff, which was definitely an option, we can say that he wouldn't have gone missing at all if his father and the other adults had been paying closer attention. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that Bill and the others did anything wrong. It was a different time, and they did what any parent would have done at that time, which was let their children play in a spot they thought was safe. Unfortunately, the result was that for a short period of time, nobody was actually watching Dennis, and that was all it took for whatever happened to happen. Abe Ramsey is a similar situation, though not quite as mysterious on the whole. This case is also on the earlier side for these kinds of disappearances that are actually being tracked, taking place on March 11th, 1919. The version we get from David Paulides and others like him is entirely inaccurate when you compare it with reports from the time, but we don't need to get into all that here. The important thing is that Abe was last seen by his siblings as they headed off to a local general store a few miles down the road from their home when they told him to turn around and head back to the house. These were children. I'm guessing that he was slowing them down, and they just didn't want to deal with a 3-year-old toddler following along behind them. Whatever the case, Abe started heading back, but it's believed that he reached a fork in the road and went the wrong direction, leading him up into the mountains where he sadly succumbed to either exposure, poison berries, or a venomous bite. All of which could have been prevented, once again, if his siblings had kept him with them, or if he'd never been allowed to leave the house in the first place. And while we're on the topic of parental or supervisory inattentiveness, I also want to go into a couple of more cases, one of which is that of Michael Reel, who was camping with his parents in Roan Mountain State Park, or it might be Rowan Mountain State Park, back in 1981, and the story beyond that point isn't entirely clear from what we have. What we do know is that at some point, either with permission from his parents or of his own volition, he left their campsite to head to another one, I believe another family member's campsite, that was elsewhere along the road. He never arrived. His mother reported him missing around noon. This story is also weird. There's a lot of conflicting information. His mother reported him missing, and they started looking for him. They were looking along the road. They were looking on the mountain he was on. And in yet another testament to the fact that kids move a lot farther than you expect them to in very little time, he was actually found several days later on a farm a few miles north of where he was last seen, and perfectly fine, aside from saying a few odd things about his experience over the weekend. Michael has actually reached out to me about correcting the record on a few things regarding this case, and I've been meaning to get back to him so we can do that properly. So for that reason, I want to refrain from covering too much of the story here, so I don't accidentally spread any misinformation about what happened. All of that being said, what this has in common with the other stories of children who went missing in this segment is that a parent allowed him to go somewhere alone, and that was obviously a bad idea. While it looks here like, a lot of parents are making the mistake of allowing children, true children, to wander off alone, it's not just them. There's also stories of older teenagers going missing, or at least people who are, high school aged. One of those is the Stacey Aris case, which is one I readily admit is hard to understand, but not necessarily because of how she went missing. The primary reason this is seen as a mystery is that nobody has ever managed to find her remains, even after 45 years, and the NPS won't release their files on her disappearance due to a criminal investigation, even though they've never explained why they believe there's a criminal element. What we do know is that Stacey was on a horseback riding and camping trip with her father in July of 1981 in the area of Sunrise Lakes in Yosemite National Park, and after reaching their camp for the night, Stacey reportedly went off to do some photography, and because she was alone, nobody knew exactly where she'd left the beaten path. There was an older man who was part of the group who accompanied her, I believe, half a mile, but after that he turned around and went back because he was too tired. Now, the mundane explanation is that Stacey went off the trail to take a picture and then ended up falling into a crevice or something to that effect, which could have been avoided if she had done any one of a few things. She could have stayed on the trail, she could have decided not to go off alone, or she could have just avoided precarious terrain. The most important thing that led to her disappearance, however, was that her father did not accompany her and allowed her to go anyway. Had he said no, or had he gone with her, she probably would not have gone missing. And I guess at a certain point, the real lesson we're learning here is don't go hiking alone. but, I mean, people are going to do that anyway, so. And with that said, there is one last case that I was able to get to in this video, but I couldn't decide where to put it. And that is the case of Jacob Gray, which has a caveat, but it's still relevant to this episode for the purpose of understanding search and rescue and how to make sure you are found if you go missing. Jacob's disappearance occurred in April of 2017 in Olympic National Park, but his absence wasn't noted until someone came across his bike and gear off the side of the road. And even then, his disappearance wasn't reported until the following day. Rangers and family members searched the trails and the river and the surrounding area, but when nothing turned up, the Park Service concluded that he must have fallen into the river and been swept away out to sea. That opinion only changed when Jacob's remains were recovered over 11 miles away and over 3,000 feet higher in elevation in the area of Ho Lake. Now, under normal circumstances, the best thing that Jacob could have done was stay put once he realized he was lost, but for some reason he kept going until he found himself so far outside of the search area that nobody would ever think to look for him there. In this case, however, the circumstances were not normal. Some have suggested that he might have fallen in with a cult, and others posit that he was trying to disappear to start a new life, but after publishing our video on his story, we received emails from both a family member and from someone else close to the case, which radically shifted our understanding of what happened. I can't share all of the details yet, as I need to obtain permission for some things, but what can be said is that Jacob did not run off to join a cult, and he probably wasn't in a rational state of mind when he left his gear behind at the riverside. This is a tragic case where nobody was truly at fault, though the National Park Service could have done a better job of trying to find him. For more on that, we have the video on the case, but put simply, they didn't try very hard this time. They did not take advantage of resources that were offered to them, and they were a little bit dismissive of the situation in a way that is uncharacteristic of the service. It's a rare thing for me to find a reason to criticize the National Park Service, but this is just one of the few times they've dropped the ball. Actually, I've begun working through some political contacts to try and push for a mobile missing persons task force within the National Park Service or the National Forest Service, or perhaps both, which was actually something suggested by the family member who contacted me. So now, with all of that out on the table, with you having examples of how these things happen and who they happen to and why they happen, I'd like to go into a little bit about how you can avoid all of this happening to you. As I said at the beginning of this video, the main reason that people tend to go missing in the woods is that they went off the trail. To go even more broadly, the main reason is that people make bad decisions. But it is in understanding why those bad decisions are made that you can plan to avoid them yourself. And there are a few basic tips for this. For one, don't go hiking alone if it is at all avoidable. This is how most of these people end up missing, and it's the reason that most of them end up not being reported missing until it's potentially already too late. Boy Scouts use the buddy system, the military uses the buddy system. There is no reason you shouldn't use the buddy system, and what you have to understand is that even if you think you're really experienced, even if you think you know everything you're doing like the back of your hand, chances are you don't. And even if you do, something unforeseen could happen, and it's good to have somebody there with you, either to hike out and get you help, to immediately render aid, or just to report that you have disappeared. Cases like Barbara Bullock's, where she had somebody with her, that person reported her missing almost immediately, and she still wasn't found, are extremely rare, and there's a reason that I lean towards foul play in that case. Obviously, using the buddy system is not an infallible method of doing things, because Mark Hansen or Jeff Haig, but it is one way that you can insulate yourself and protect yourself from possibilities on the trail that you might not have foreseen. Now, of course, being as we've looked at a few cases where the buddy system didn't do enough, that's where making sure that you're actually prepared comes in. Using the Mark Hansen example, Mark was not prepared in any way for that hike. He did not have the proper shoes with him. He did not have the proper equipment with him. He had never been hiking in that area before. He had never been hiking before. He had never been hiking at altitude before. I mean, most of it's that he'd never been hiking before, but you get my point. And then he took the one thing that was sort of prepared, which was the backpack he had, and he left it behind. Now, of course, the bigger problem in Mark's case is that he panicked, but he only panicked because he was unprepared, and because his friend pushed him beyond his limits. So I guess caveat to the buddy system thing, if one person says it's time to stop, it's best for everybody to stop. which also would have made sure Jim McGrogan didn't disappear. Also would have made sure that Stacey Aris didn't disappear. Now, oftentimes, this lack of preparedness is simply an issue of not knowing what you're supposed to be doing, not knowing what the environment you're headed into requires of you, like with Jordan Grider, but that is easily remedied by doing research before you leave. And if you find yourself in a situation where there's a hike you want to do, but you can't afford all the necessary equipment, or you can't find anybody to go with you, or you're not sure about the weather, there's a very simple way to not be caught unprepared out in the wilderness. Don't go. If you are unsure that you can complete the trek you're about to go on, don't do it. And if you do, stay on the trail. The last thing you want to do in a missing person situation, as I think I've made abundantly clear by this point, is leave the trail. Now, there is, of course, the situation where you might feel forced to leave the trail, which is the panic we talked about. It's what Eloise Lindsay was driven off for. It's what Jeff Haig was driven off for. It's what Hansen was driven off for. For some reason or another, they all believed that staying on the trail was going to endanger their lives, and they all chose to leave. And to be fair, this is one of the most difficult to account for. Now, you can hedge against it. You can hedge against panic by training yourself to not panic. I mean, that seems probably pretty obvious. But you can also do other things. Like I said, if you are fully prepared and confident in your preparedness, you are less likely to panic. One thing that a lot of hiking channels will not tell you, and that I will say is not something you can always do, but one thing that helps me not panic on the trail, in situations like Eloise Lindsay, where in cases where you do think you're being followed by an animal, by a person, whatever, the way that I ensure that I don't panic because of thinking I'm being followed is that I stay strapped. I carry a gun. If it is legal for me to carry a gun on the trail, I'm carrying a gun on the trail. Frankly, if it's a gray area about whether or not it's legal for me to carry a gun on the trail, I'm probably carrying a gun on the trail. There are alternatives. You can carry bear spray. You could bring a katana, I suppose. But nothing is more effective than a gun at killing things at distance. If you have to use a katana, it's too late. If the bear spray doesn't work, it's too late. You know what works on bears? .357 Magnum, every time. I'm being very serious here. When I hike, I carry a .357 Magnum Smith & Wesson revolver. Model 13-2. It's beautiful. I love it. Sometimes I carry a 45 or a 10 mil instead, but that's not the point. The point is that if you are hiking along the trail and somebody is following you, by having a firearm, you have made it much less reasonable to panic. You have given yourself a reason to stand your ground and not feel fear, which is better than panicking and running off of the trail. I don't know what we can say for certain about Eloise Lindsay being followed by people on the trail, but if she was being followed, and she had a gun, she probably wouldn't have needed to run off the trail. I do want to be clear that I am not advocating that if you're just hiking along the trail and somebody happens to be behind you, you turn around and brandish a weapon. That's a bad idea. That will get you arrested. But if you find yourself in a situation where your options are stand your ground or leave the trail, you're much better off standing your ground with a firearm than leaving the trail. And then, of course, there's the little things, like wear the right clothes, bring the right shoes, don't wear flip-flops to go hiking on the Appalachian Trail. Don't bring, a school backpack hiking in Panama. And at the end of the day, like I said, I was setting out with this episode to find one specific thing that is the main driver of people going missing in the wilderness. And as we come to the conclusion of it, I think that the one thing is unpreparedness. Lack of properly equipping yourself for the trip ahead. Going on journeys that you aren't confident that you can complete. All of these boil down to not being prepared. So the way I'd like to end the video, I guess, is by going over what being prepared to go hiking looks like. Because there's the bare minimum, and then there's what I would recommend, but those are different things. The bare minimum, you should have a good pair of hiking boots, you should have a good change of clothes, you should have enough food to get you through from point A to point B, you should have plenty of water, and by plenty of water, I don't mean a water bottle or two. I mean as much water as you can feasibly carry without wearing yourself down. And you should probably also have some water purification tablets in case you run out of water and need to take some from a stream. Also, just as an aside, if the choice is between dying of thirst or potentially getting riverborne illnesses, take the riverborne illnesses. I do want to be clear that what I mean there is it's been 3 days without any water whatsoever, and if you don't drink water now, you're going to die. I do not mean it's been a few hours, you ran out of your water bottles, and you don't want to deal with the taste of a water purification tablet. In that case, deal with the taste of the water purification tablet, because Giardia is not fun. Dysentery sucks. Not a good experience. Killed a lot of people on the Oregon Trail and everywhere else. But if you find yourself in a life or death situation where if you go on any longer without water, you're going to die, drink the river water. Drink the stream water. Probably don't drink still water unless you have a way to boil it. And if at all possible, boil the water. Now, this is advice that probably is not going to be necessary for a simple day hike, but if you are doing through hiking, if you are camping, anything like that, it is good to have as much with you as you possibly can. I know we went through probably, 8 bottles of water each, hiking up to Spence Field and down. He's not answering me.
Something like that.
Yeah. We had to use our water purification tablets at one point. And this was a 6-mile hike up and 6-mile hike down. So 12 miles total, 8 bottles of water each. Did we maybe drink more than we needed to? Yes. Was I glad that we brought plenty of water? Also yes. But preparedness does not mean bringing the right equipment alone. And I'll try to link to a good source on bare minimums for packing, because I'm probably not covering all of it. But there's also the other forms of preparation. Going with somebody is a good one. I understand people like solo hiking. I understand that some people like hiking and can't always find somebody to go with. But I cannot stress enough how unnecessarily dangerous solo hiking is. If it is at all possible for you to bring a companion with you, do so. I don't mean go and find somebody you don't trust, but I mean that if your choice is between taking a risky hike up a mountain alone or not going, you are inevitably going to be safer not going. But if the choice is between going alone and going with a person and you have that choice, take a person. And it may be that you get halfway up and that person wasn't ready for the hike, and you know what? It's time to turn around and head back. Always prioritize your safety over what you perceive your abilities to be. And part of prioritizing your safety, of course, is understanding the trail you're about to be on. Like I said, not everything is what's in your backpack. Some of it is who you take with you, and some of it is the knowledge you arm yourself with before you go. If you know the route you're supposed to be going, if you understand land navigation, if you can use a map and a compass, not just a phone, because let's be realistic, that's not the most reliable way to go about things. But if you can use a map and a compass and you know your route, you're going to be a lot safer than if you looked it up once on all trails or you just said, you know what, screw it, I'm going to follow the trail signs. Because as we know, that isn't always enough. I'm not saying you have to have your orienteering merit badge, but, you know, being able to tell what direction you're heading and read landmarks on a map is important. And another important thing that you can do before you even set off on a hike is let somebody know where you're going and when you plan to be back. And the more information you give people, the better. You can say, hey, I'm going to hit this trail and I'll be back at 4 p.m. That's good. They know to call if you're not back by 4 p.m. But if you say, I'm going to be on this trail and I plan to be here at 3 p.m., here at 4 p.m., here at 5 p.m., here at 6 p.m., stay the night here, and then be here the next day at this time of day, and you can set up as many check-ins as possible, then say that you had a check-in at 5 p.m. and you missed the one at 6. Well, the person you told where you are is going to know where they should start looking for you. If you don't have any check-in options, then at the very least it gives people a timeline on where you expected to be and where you might have gone off trail and why you might have done it. But of course, the best thing you can do is stay on the trail. I will never stop advocating for being properly armed when you're hiking. It's not just about other people. There are bears out there. There are wildcats out there. There are sometimes wolves out there. And, you know, of course, there are other people out there. And you never know what their plans are. You know, with guns, it's a matter of better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And just to further reiterate on that, the best calibers for anti-animal tend to be things like .357 Magnum and 10 millimeter. That wouldn't necessarily be true of hunting, but for self-defense purposes, those are probably your best options. And if you're not a good shot, Well, actually, I'll let the firearms experts handle that one. Personally, I am a better shot with a single-action revolver than anything else. Really, the biggest reason to differentiate between whether you're going to take a .357 revolver or a 10mm handgun is which one you are more accurate with, which one you're more comfortable shooting, because a revolver is usually going to be limited to 6 rounds, and a 10mm can have got up to 15 or 16, depending on the size of a gun you get. There's also the issue of, not freaking other people out on the trail, which I've never had a problem with carrying while I'm hiking, but you can conceal a 10mm pretty easily, and for some reason, people just don't get as freaked out about revolvers in leather holsters as they do. People get less freaked out about revolvers than they do semi-automatic pistols for some reason. And of course, respect and obey the laws of wherever you are. Don't risk getting arrested because there might be a bear somewhere. And if there is a trail that you're concerned about wildlife and you're not allowed to carry with you, I personally wouldn't hike that trail. At the very least, bring a non-lethal like bear spray. Like I said, I think I'm gonna kind of, when I have some more time, condense this video down a little bit more and create a good list of all the things that you should properly have with you when you're hiking, at least at a minimum, and then what my preferred hiking kit is. Take my words with a grain of salt. I am not a hiking expert. I am just a person who studied a lot of times that people went missing while hiking. So before the thru hikers and such start yelling at me, I am open to constructive criticism. That is all I'm going to say. And with all of that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was a little unorthodox for our usual stuff. Again, I'm sorry. We had a short week. I wrote this entirely in one day, and frankly, I'm surprised it turned out this coherent. But if you like this, or if you at least like our other videos, and I encourage you to check out the ones mentioned here because they are far more comprehensive, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. YouTube really likes it when you hit the notification bell, even though they don't like using the notifications. If you want to support us directly, there are a few ways you can do that. You can check us out on Patreon. It is $1 a month, and you can watch our episodes ad-free, and usually about an hour early. We've also got Pepperbox. We're over there. We have some exclusives. That one's a little bit more expensive at, I believe, $8 a month, correct? Yeah, $8 a month. But you get ad-free access to our channel, as well as dozens of others from your favorite creators, especially the guys at Unsubscribe and some of those other channels, and I believe we will be bringing History Unhinged over there soon, too. You can also buy our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk, from Tableau Roasting Company, or get our merch from Bunker Branding. All of those are linked in the description, and if you would like to get more Lodge, if the Lore Lodge is not enough, if you want just so much more Lodge, you can do so by checking out History Unhinged, The Lore Lads, which is our podcast, my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, which I haven't used in a little while because I've just been very busy. I bought a house and getting married and all that. You can check out Thornbury's channel, Silver Retention, where he goes in deep on how movies have been made. And am I missing any of our channels? Lore on Location, where you can see us do lore on location. And Weird Bible, which we were supposed to have a video coming out for, but then somebody got pneumonia, and it was just a whole big thing. So that'll be coming out later. And last but not least, if you would like to meet us, you can do so at Blobfest 2026, right here in Phoenixville. That is on July 10th and 11th. There's a lot of booths, there's a lot of shops, there's good food, there's horror movies. It's just a general fun little, horror convention that we host here in Phoenixville outside. Yeah, we have a tent every year. People come by, they hang, they usually end up bringing me milk, which I'm not unappreciative of. I've just still not gotten used to it. And just to be clear, in case the video didn't already make it clear enough, don't show up to be weird, because I'm always carrying. I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.